It took several weeks of intense negotiations between international players to secure the truce between Israel and Hamas. Media reports citing senior U.S. officials say the process involved daily, sometimes hourly talks at senior levels with negotiators from Qatar, Egypt, as well as Israel. A secret cell headed by the CIA and Mossad chiefs were also involved. U.S. President Joe Biden himself made 13 calls to Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu on this matter. Negotiations proved difficult, with messages having to pass from Doha or Cairo into Gaza and back. There were also several disruptions at Qatar, which had been playing the main mediating role, could not get hold of Hamas. Then there were the disagreements over details. Hamas's initial demand was for a 10-day pause for hostilities, and that was rejected by Israel. On the 25th of October, Hamas said it could guarantee about 50 releases in the first phase, but its formal list came up short. As the Israeli bombing of Gaza intensified, President Biden called Prime Minister Netanyahu on the 14th of November and urged him to move on the deal. But even with the deal in sight that day, it stalled again as Hamas broke off talks. That's after Israeli military forces stormed El-Shifa hospital in Gaza, which they claim had served as a Hamas command center. It took several days for talks to resume again. Within a week, both sides agreed on the new draft, which saw the Israeli cabinet taking its final vote to approve the truce. More insight, Professor Amos Guerra joins us live from Salt Lake City. He is from the College of Law in the University of Utah. Professor, we just heard that a tortuous process to get this deal as it is right now. But we could also argue that while all lives are valuable, the candidates which are up for release on both sides, you could say that both sides might find it easier to justify the release of these particular candidates.
First of all, thank you for having me. I think that's correct. I think that this first round, the hostages who will be released are women and children. The Palestinian prisoners who will be released have been convicted of various terrorist-related crimes. But I think you're right. From both sides, this is a first go an easier round. I think hopefully one hopes that down the road more and more hostages will be released, but releasing women and children, as you correctly note, is a not easy first step, but is a logical first step.
So what happens after the 4 days? 4 days is a very long time in any conflict. In the Middle East, 4 days could be a lifetime.
Absolutely correct. Netanyahu promised the extreme right-wing members of his government that the fighting will continue after 4 days. I think there will be pressure from President Biden, perhaps not to go forward or to slow down the pace in order to give an opportunity to release more hostages. I assume the negotiations will continue. It's also important to add that in addition to the release of the 50 hostages Thursday, Israel time, one hopes that indeed the Red Cross will be granted access to the hostages who are still being held. That is something that has not yet taken place to the best of my understanding. That's absolutely essential to determine what's their condition, to ensure their welfare, and then we can, I really do hope, move forward and ultimately release all of the hostages.
Professor Guerra, as you mentioned, Mr. Netanyahu has been very clear, and I quote him, "I want to make clear we are at war and we will continue in the war." Now, the release of hostages and a pause in fighting to allow essentially your rival, your enemy, to regroup and to rest is not in the interest of Israel Defense Forces. So how does the mindset of allowing for peace just for 4 days, allowing for the release of hostages, how does that factor into the fact that you are running a war, you are returning to the war, and the mindset of a war is very different from a ceasefire?
You're right. So much so that I think it was an hour ago that it's been announced in Israel that some of the reservists who've been called up, after October 7th and have been there for, 6-7 weeks, will be given some a pass to go home for a tad. I don't know how long that will last, and that's going to raise questions. Indeed, what you're asking, how easy will it be to resume after 4 days, and if the 4 days extends to a few more days, can you really truly regroup? Considering that Netanyahu has promised, quote unquote, to destroy, defeat Hamas. I think it's an open question where we go after the 4 days. And I think it's also, frankly, an open question what kind of pressure Qatar will put on Hamas and on Israel and what kind of pressure President Biden will put on Netanyahu to give more time for more prisoner releases. And there is great pressure in Israel and Netanyahu to return the prisoners. If you ask me, this is not a deal he wanted to make. He was forced into it by twin forces of President Biden and the Israeli public, which understood that there's nothing more important than having Israelis come home safely.
All right, so on the one hand, a final question here, Professor Gira. President Biden on the one hand, the Israeli public on the other, and we've already heard from our correspondent earlier, the National Security Minister coming out to call this a very bad deal, comparing it to the 2011 deal that saw one Israeli soldier being exchanged for 1,000 Palestinian prisoners. So voices like that in the Knesset, will they matter when it comes to Israel keeping to its side of the bargain and perhaps extending this 4-day truce?
So you referenced the National Security Minister, the Police Minister, Itamar Ben-Gvir, who initially was opposed to the release. Ultimately, I think came and voted in favor of it because of Netanyahu's promise that the war will continue. Ben-Gvir and his ally, the Finance Minister Smotrich, two extremists, opposed it, but then voted in favor of it. Netanyahu, as the Prime Minister, carried the day. Ben-Gvir, who is truly an extremist, I think here has been outflanked, outvoted. And I think there is an understanding in Israel more that return of the hostages is the single most important issue. Ben-Gvir continue with his propaganda ranting. It's not going to carry force.
Oh, thanks for that. Professor Amos Gira speaking to us live there from Salt Lake City.